This is the Arcade1Up Rampage cabinet from Tastemakers. The first two machines we did videos for were Atari based, and this one has games from several publishers, with 3 of the 4 games on here being wonderful examples of early versions of concurrent multiplayer in arcade games. This is a party machine. So, coming off the main menu, getting into the game, you're going to hit that top red button, which is the jump button for Rampage. When you make your selection, that's where the little A button is that you're supposed to hit. Rampage was released in 1986 and was really successful, though it didn't really light the world on fire. The development team wanted to make a game with no wrong way to play, and the only real objective is to destroy all the buildings in a city and then move on to the next one. The cities all generally look samey, with minor variations in the foreground and everything and in the buildings, but it's basically the same thing over and over again. The control deck has 3 identical sets of controls, each consisting of a joystick and 2 buttons. This allowed for up to 3 players to play simultaneously, making it a really fun game with friends. When I went to see this in the arcade nearby, it became really clear why getting the Arcade1Up cabinets is a much better proposition than an authentic arcade machine. Beyond the cost and the weight of the machine and the maintenance and potential failure of the monitor and all these other things, you can see in this video that I took that the characters are ghosting. Something wrong with the video in this actual arcade machine in an arcade. So if I owned this actual cabinet, I'd be pretty upset. Fortunately, with the Arcade1Up version, you get a perfect screen every time you play at home with these cabinets, and it's worth it for that alone. And this is a really, really fun party game. You get 3 people on this machine spread out, and there's room for 3 people. It looks tight. It's a small machine. These are all very small versions of the machines, the actual arcade machines. But it works. If you've got the riser and you've got it lifted up, you can have somebody off to the left side there, somebody in the center, and somebody off to the right side. And if you've got stools, everybody can sit pretty comfortably side by side and still reach the controls with no problem. I played it 3 players, and we all did pretty well with it overall. So, this is a really good port of the game. They all are, and they're all the actual arcade ROMs that are in there. Not the actual arcade ROMs, but the actual code from the arcade that's in there. So it makes it a very authentic experience. And the great thing with this was, since I'm not pumping quarters into it, I was able to continue and continue and continue and get farther in the game than I ever did in real life, because I just didn't want to keep putting money into it. Now I don't have to. I could potentially see the end of this game, which is very far into the cities as you make your way around the country, destroying everything in sight. So, worth it. As the marquee title, it's a really good title to have, and the button layout works well for most of the other games, not quite all of them. We'll see that when we get to the last game, Defender. That's definitely got some issues with the button layout, and it's mainly because of those joysticks there. So, moving into the end of Rampage, just like in the arcade, you've got the chance to continue your game if you want, but we're not going to do that, obviously. So, just like every other Arcade1Up machine, to get back to the main menu, you're going to hold down that 1 player button for about 5 seconds. It'll kick you back to the main menu where you get a chance to pick a different game entirely. We're going into Gauntlet. So Gauntlet, this is interesting. Gauntlet was released in 1985 by Atari, and it's a 1 to 4 player game in the arcades. So up to 4 players. Because of size constraints and the layout of Rampage, which is the marquee title here, we're limited to 2 players. If we can fit 3 for Rampage, I don't understand why we can't fit or do 3 for Gauntlet. But we're limited to 2 players here in Gauntlet at the most. So Ed Logg, who also developed Asteroids, Centipede, and Millipede, came up with the concept for this, basing it, he said, on his son's love of Dungeons and Dragons and his own interest in an Atari 8-bit computer game called Dandy. That's trouble, because if you look up Atari 8-bit Dandy, you'll see this Gauntlet is pretty much a ripoff of it, and it led to threats of a lawsuit and an eventual settlement, and things were ugly. But it's pretty clear. The concept came straight from there. It's a very similar game. So this was Atari's first arcade game to feature a voice synthesizer chip, which you can hear every now and then in the background. It's a brutally tough game. It's a dungeon crawler brawler which comes down to fighting and using magic potions, and the magic potions wipe out most everything that's on screen at the time. You absolutely need them later in the game for death, because that's the only way to kill death, who will chase you down and just wipe you out. But because of the brutally tough game design, which was designed to separate you from your quarters as quickly as possible, multiplayer becomes almost a necessity here. And you can see the evidence of it with my hard-fought solo showing here, where I die often, like now. And I just pump another virtual quarter into the machine and continue, which is nice. It's nice that you can do that. So I played it as a 2-player experience here, and it works great. It's kind of a bummer that it's not a 3-player experience, at least. Obviously they couldn't do 4. That would be really squeezing a lot of stuff onto a very small cabinet. So that's understandable. But, the game is just as fun as it was in the arcades. It's pretty awesome. It's even more so, I'd say, since you can just keep adding virtual quarters without emptying your real pockets, which is pretty awesome in its own right. As an arcade game, though, it's fun. It's your basic party game. This is one where you can get a couple players together, and a lot of people are going to remember this one from the arcades. It was a pretty popular game, and it's one that always brought a smile to our faces with me and my friends. Anytime we saw it in the arcade, we'd all jump on it together, because it's just that kind of a game. So let's put this aside now, because it's Gauntlet. It's exactly as it was in the arcades, minus 2 of the players. And let's move on next to Joust. So Williams Electronics released Joust in 1982, and it really helped cement the 2-player co-op idea in arcade machines. Its popularity has endured, and it was even featured as the first challenge in the book Ready Player One. Not the movie, the book. So the idea for the game was to make a flight-based 2-player game, and the developers couldn't really decide, what that was going to be or how to do it. So they went through a number of different ideas, and they eventually settled on birds. So the simplicity of the concept and the single screen really allows for some furious combat. You have to flap your wings, flap the wings of the bird. Really, the joystick only controls left and right, and the flapping of the wings by tapping that button controls your altitude. So it's a very different kind of a control scheme from most games, and the management really wasn't sure that this was even going to work, and they weren't too high on it until they actually saw it, in action, and clearly it became one of the all-time classics. So, the developers were really onto something here. One cool thing, really cool thing, that I ran into here is there's a glitch in the game that was also in the arcade, which makes sense because it's the same code, but it's something I'd almost completely forgotten about. So when you reach one of the upper levels here, and you'll see it coming up, the upper platforms dissolve, and a small line a few pixels high stays on the screen, right about where my bird is now, right at that corner of that platform. And when your character flies across it, you'll wipe it right out of the screen. And when I first saw it on this cabinet, it hit me, and the memories came flooding back. And then I started to think, well, am I imagining this whole thing? This had to be in the arcade. Was it in the arcade? I'm not entirely sure. I'm pretty sure I remember this, and how it was always this weird glitch, and I'd forgotten all about it, and maybe I'm crazy. And so I went to the arcade and checked it out, and you can see in my crappy picture that I took that, yeah, there it is. It's right there. And when I get past the egg wave here, you're going to see it here on this screen, and it just kind of freaked me out. It's so cool. It's kind of silly to get excited about something so minor, but I had forgotten all about it, and it hit me like I was a kid in the arcades all over again when it happened here on this machine. It was really cool to get that feeling and get that experience. And there it is, right there. You can see it. I'm pointing it out to you because it's just so cool. It's dumb, and it's expected because it's the same code, but it's just so cool. And flying over it just wipes it from the screen. So those little glitches are there. Everything you remember from the arcade, it's there. It's awesome. So unfortunately, as with some of the other arcade games here, your high scores aren't saved on Joust when you turn the machine off. And this one's a little harder to swallow because the actual arcade machine had 3 AA batteries in the back of it so that it would save you the settings and the high scores even if the machine was unplugged from the wall. So this, if anything, this is one that should absolutely save your high scores, but when you turn off the machine, they're gone, unfortunately. So, alright, that's just one of those things we have to deal with. It's not a killer. It's not a reason to not buy the machine. But let's move on to Defender. And Defender, this one's rough. And you can see just about every single button on the cabinet is used for this game because Defender uses 5 buttons and a joystick. Unfortunately, because of the layout of this with the joysticks, you have to kind of reach around that third joystick over there on the right really gets in your way. Trying to reach the buttons and be able to shoot and use your smart bombs and everything else that you need to do, it just becomes really, really difficult in an already difficult game. So, Defender, if I haven't mentioned it, is an incredibly difficult arcade game. It was released by Williams Electronics in 1981. It was the first arcade game from Eugene Jarvis, who went on to create the sequel, Stargate, as well as Robotron 2084, awesome game, Narc, and Smash TV, another awesome game, and a whole lot more. So Defender was a massive hit, and it became one of the highest grossing arcade games of all time. This was an incredibly difficult game to play even in the arcades, with a joystick and 5 buttons needed to control the ship and the weapons. And I'll show you the layout of the actual arcade game. The control deck, it's daunting when you see this in the arcade. It was one that worried me the first time I saw it, and one that I was scared to play. But I saw my friends playing it, and they were getting good at it. So I dug into it. Unfortunately, it becomes really hard to play on the Arcade1Up cabinet, just because, the buttons are all available. They're all mapped essentially to the same positions as they were in the arcade, but those other 2 joysticks, well, the one on the right especially, really tends to get in the way of what you're doing. And it takes an already hard game and makes it even harder. That being said, I still play it as often as I can because it's such a great game. And personally, I was more into the sequel, Stargate, and I got really good at that one. I was routinely putting up scores of 150,000 or more, which, if you know the games, that's a pretty good score. It's a side-scrolling shooter with really colorful animations and a wonderful variety of enemies. It's just a great game overall, but it's very, very tough to play with this control deck. So for the cabinet overall, if you routinely have friends over, I'd strongly recommend this cabinet. It is essentially filled with party games, making it worth the $299. You've got several multiplayer games where everybody can play at the same time, where nobody's waiting to take a turn, and that just makes it that much more fun. So I hope this was helpful, and please let us know in the comments. And also check out our other Arcade1Up cabinet close looks here on YouTube. Thanks for watching.